The northern coast of the Kola Peninsula is a desolate landscape of jagged granite and freezing mist, where the Barents Sea grinds against the edge of the world. For decades, this was the most heavily militarized zone on the planet, a place where the Soviet Union's Northern Fleet kept its nuclear teeth sharp. Yet, on the official topographic maps of the era, a specific stretch of coastline near the closed city of Polyarny appeared as nothing but empty wilderness. There were no roads marked, no structures indicated, just the lonely interface of rock and cold water. But the maps were a lie. Local fishermen and the residents of nearby Zato, closed administrative territorial entities, whispered of a secret that the Soviet state had scrubbed from the record. They spoke of massive steel doors hidden behind artificial rock faces and heavy transport convoys that disappeared into the cliffs under the cover of the long polar night. They called it the Gospital Podvodnikov, the submarine hospital. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the curtain of secrecy was torn away, revealing a hollowed-out mountain that defied belief. It was a massive, multi-level medical complex carved directly into the bedrock, designed to be invisible from the air and invulnerable to nuclear strike. It was a facility that officially never existed, yet it contained thousands of square meters of sterilized operating theaters, recovery wards, and laboratories. There were no declassified documents found in the central archives to explain its construction. There were no photographs in the naval history books showing a ribbon-cutting ceremony. There were only the rumors of the men who had been taken there in the back of windowless trucks and the haunting, empty halls that remained. To the uninitiated, the concept of a submarine hospital sounds redundant. Every major naval base has medical facilities, but the Soviet Navy's nuclear submarine program was not a conventional service. It was a high-stakes gamble with human life and environmental stability. The crews of the Project 667 and Project 941 boats didn't just carry ballistic missiles, they carried a unique set of catastrophic problems that the Soviet state was desperate to keep secret. The primary driver was radiation exposure. In the early days of the Soviet nuclear fleet, reactor shielding was often compromised to save weight or speed up production. Minor leaks were common, and sailors were frequently exposed to doses that would be considered lethal in any civilian setting. Bringing these men to a public hospital in Murmansk was impossible. The sight of dozens of young men with falling hair and weeping skin would have sparked a panic and revealed the true cost of Soviet naval supremacy. Then there was the psychological collapse. Spending months in a pressurized steel tube hundreds of meters beneath the ice, with the knowledge that you are a primary target for a nuclear strike, takes a toll on the human psyche. The Soviets experienced compartment fever, violent psychological breaks that required specialized high-security psychiatric care, far from the prying eyes of the Red Cross or Western intelligence. The Soviet Navy needed a place to treat these crews without the world, or even the rest of the military, knowing they were sick at all. The hospital was built underground, not just for protection, but for containment. It was a medical black site where a sailor could be erased from his unit, treated for radiation sickness or a mental breakdown, and either returned to duty or quietly discharged with no paper trail ever leaving the mountain. The end of the submarine hospital didn't come with a gradual decommissioning or a phased drawdown. It ended with a frantic 48-hour evacuation in the late 1980s that looked less like a military move and more like a flight from a plague. Former orderlies and guards, speaking years later under the veil of anonymity, described a scene of controlled chaos. Orders came down from the Northern Fleet Command to clear the facility immediately. Patients who could walk were loaded into trucks. Those who couldn't were allegedly moved to other installations, whose locations remain unknown. Doctors were given hours to pack their personal belongings before being reassigned to distant posts across the Union. When the doors were finally swung shut, though not locked, the mountain was left in a state of suspended animation. Western intelligence, alerted by the sudden cessation of electronic chatter from the site, sent reconnaissance teams once the chaos of 1991 allowed for closer inspection. What they found inside was unsettling. In the primary surgical bay, the scene was a masterpiece of the uncanny. The operating rooms were fully intact. Stainless steel trays sat atop rolling carts holding scalpels and clamps that gleamed under the torchlight. There were no signs of a struggle, no bloodstains, no chaos, just a sterile, frozen readiness. Moving into the recovery wards, the sensation of interruption became overwhelming. The beds were still made, the sheets pulled tight with military precision, the pillows fluffed. In the nurses' stations, medical charts were scattered across the desks as if the staff had just stepped out for a cigarette and never returned. But when the inspectors began to leaf through the files, the professional curiosity turned to dread. The charts were a mess of redactions. Names were meticulously blacked out with heavy ink. Personal histories were gone. Most unsettlingly, the diagnosis column for dozens of patients was left blank, replaced only with alphanumeric codes. The dates of admission were clear, but the dates of discharge were missing. It wasn't a hospital that had been decommissioned, it was the scene of a mass disappearance, a medical Mary Celeste buried in the granite of the North. As the team descended into the third and lowest level of the facility, the architecture of the facility began to change. The wide utilitarian corridors of the upper floors narrowed. The walls, previously painted a calming hospital green, transitioned into raw, unpainted concrete. At the far end of a long, dimly lit tunnel, they encountered a barrier that shouldn't have been there. A reinforced steel bulkhead, thicker than those on a Typhoon-class submarine, marked only with the numbers 015. There were no Red Cross symbols here, no signs indicating internal medicine or radiology. There was only a keypad and a mechanical override. When the team finally forced the doors open, the sound of the metal grinding against the floor echoed like a scream through the facility. The air that rushed out of the wing was different. It didn't smell like the rest of the mountain. It was filtered, sterile, and cold, an unnatural, pressurized atmosphere that had been maintained by an independent life support system that was somehow still drawing power from an unknown source. This was not a wing for injuries. This was not where you brought a sailor with a broken leg or a burst appendix. The layout was a series of small, isolated chambers, more like containment chambers than hospital rooms. Each room featured a heavy observation window made of leaded glass, 6 inches thick, looking into a space with sensors that the Western specialists couldn't immediately identify. They found neural monitoring headgear, restraints bolted directly into the floor, and isolation tanks designed to strip a human being of all sensory input. It became clear that Object 704 had a dual purpose. The upper levels were the submarine hospital, a necessary cover for the Navy's casualties, but the lower levels, the locked Wing 015, was a laboratory. It was a place where the Soviet state explored the limits of human endurance, not to save lives, but to forge better weapons. In the central vault of Wing 015, the team discovered a series of logbooks bound in heavy gray leather. These were the true records, the documents that were never intended to be seen by the Ministry of Health or even the Naval High Command. As the translators began to work through the Cyrillic script, a terrifying picture of Soviet medical science emerged. The logs listed treatments and protocols that didn't exist in any known medical textbook. There were entries for long-term isolation therapy, where subjects were kept in total darkness and silence for periods exceeding 90 days to observe the point of psychological fragmentation. There were files on neural response suppression, detailing the use of experimental drugs to dampen the fear response in sailors serving on nuclear-armed vessels. But the most frequent entries concerned radiation tolerance testing. The Soviets weren't just treating radiation sickness, they were trying to engineer a way around it. The records suggested that patients, often the survivors of reactor accidents, were being subjected to further controlled doses of radiation to see if the human body could be hardened through repeated exposure. It was a horrific, inverted form of immunization. The most haunting discovery, however, was a recurring classification in the patient status column. For certain individuals, the ledger did not say recovered or deceased. It used the term bezvozvratny, non-returnable. These patients were not dead, yet they were effectively erased. They were removed from all personnel records, their families told they had died at sea in accidents that were never fully explained. According to the notes, these non-returnables were moved even deeper into the mountain, to a level that the inspection team couldn't reach because the elevators had been welded shut from the inside. As the team prepared to leave, a haunting realization set in. Object 704 wasn't just a hospital or even a laboratory, it was a filter. It was where the Soviet Navy took the broken pieces of its human machinery and decided which parts could be fixed, which could be studied, and which needed to disappear forever. To this day, the names of the non-returnables remain a secret, buried in a facility that officially never existed, beneath a mountain that still keeps its silence. As the investigators cross-referenced the fragments of recovered paperwork with the official history of the Soviet Northern Fleet, a disturbing pattern emerged from the ink. The medical files in the mountain were stamped with tactical hull numbers, the unique identifiers for specific vessels. When the analysts checked these numbers against the public records held by the Ministry of Defense, they found a series of impossible contradictions. According to the Soviet press, the submarines listed in these files were the pride of the Navy. They were boats like the K-219 or the early Victor-class hunters, reported as having conducted exemplary and successful patrols in the North Atlantic. These were the vessels that were awarded medals for their endurance and their ability to slip through NATO's SOS-US detection nets without a sound. But the hospital records told a different story. For every successful patrol celebrated in Moscow, there was a corresponding entry at the submarine hospital. The logs showed that while the boats were being hailed as triumphs of Soviet engineering, their crews were being admitted to the mountain in secret. In some cases, an entire watch section of 30 men would be checked in simultaneously, suffering from varying degrees of acute environmental stress, a vague term that masked something much darker. The crews quietly disappeared afterwards. They weren't seen at the victory parades in Murmansk. They weren't interviewed by Krasnaya Zvyozda. They were replaced by fresh faces, while the original sailors remained in the underground wards, their careers and identities effectively cauterized. The hospital wasn't saving these sailors for a return to society. It was containing the human consequences of a nuclear program that was moving faster than its safety protocols could keep up with. It was a clearinghouse for the broken, a place where the state's failures were buried in the bedrock so the myth of the invincible Soviet Navy could remain intact. The abandonment of a facility as strategically vital as the submarine hospital was a move of absolute desperation. One final hastily written report found in a scorched pile near the primary incinerator hinted at the catastrophe that broke the facility's back. It wasn't a reactor meltdown on a docked sub, and it wasn't a chemical leak from the ventilation system. It was something far more difficult to contain. The report described a neurological contamination event. It began in the deep wards of Wing 015. The patients, sailors who had spent too long in the high-pressure, radiation-soaked environments of the experimental boats, began to exhibit a specific, contagious set of symptoms. It started with visual and auditory displacement, a sense that the senses were no longer aligned with reality. But then the doctors began to show the same symptoms as the patients. The contagion was psychological, or perhaps even something more profound, a breakdown of the neural response suppression that the facility had been trying to engineer. The staff reported a cascading cognitive failure among the orderlies and surgeons. The very men and women trained to observe the madness were being consumed by the madness. When the command at the Northern Fleet headquarters realized that the medical black site was becoming a source of instability that could no longer be managed, they didn't send in more doctors, they didn't send in a cleanup crew, they ordered an immediate total shutdown. Total silence was mandated under the threat of execution. They realized that the mountain had become a petri dish for a sickness that didn't just affect the body, but the mind's ability to perceive the world. To save the rest of the fleet, they had to cut the mountain out like a tumor. The evacuation was a study in selective erasure. The Soviet military was meticulous about what they took and what they abandoned. Heavy diagnostic equipment, the state-of-the-art centrifugal testers, and the primary data processing mainframes were dismantled and hauled away in the dead of night. The central archives were partially burned, leaving the investigators with nothing but the singed edges of the truth. But some things were left behind deliberately, things that tell a story of a place that feared its own inhabitants. The beds in the lowest levels weren't just standard hospital cots. They were heavy steel frames bolted directly into the concrete floor, fitted with industrial-grade restraints. Entire rooms had been welded shut from the outside, the steel plates fused to the door frames with a permanence that suggested they were never meant to be opened again. The air inside those rooms remains a secret, perhaps containing the last breaths of those the state deemed non-returnables. To this day, the facility near Polarny remains a ghost on the map. Despite the fall of the Berlin Wall and the rise of the modern Russian Federation, no official files have ever been released that confirm the true purpose of Object 704. No nation has stepped forward to claim responsibility for the experiments conducted in Wing 015, and no veterans organization has ever been allowed to seek records of the men who were sent there. The submarine hospital stands as a silent monument to the darkest impulses of the Cold War. It is a reminder that the race for military supremacy wasn't just fought with missiles and steel, but with the very bodies and minds of the men who served. One thing is certain, the mountain wasn't built just to heal sailors who had given too much for their country. It was built to deal with what those submarines brought back from the crushing depths, the radiation, the psychological fractures, and the secrets that the world was never meant to see. As the Arctic winds continue to howl through its empty corridors, Object 704 keeps its secrets, guarding the non-returnables and the truth of what happens when a superpower decides that the survival of its ideology is worth more than the humanity of its soldiers.